WLPFM Albuquerque,
ladies and gentlemen,
a future broadcasters company.
New Mexico Black Leadership Council. And I'm going to be your moderator this evening. Learning to Drive stands for Demystifying Roundhouse Rules, Introduce, Vote, Enact. So tonight we're starting a conversation, and it's just an initial conversation about not just learning, but actively engaging and understanding the very fabric of our government, our legislative process. And just as a driver knows the rules of the road, each of us needs to grasp how our government functions, recognizing that it's supposed to be of the people, by the people, and for the people, all of the people. So this session is designed to foster very much a nonpartisan, non-political dialogue that goes beyond any single issue. We know that there's lots of issues that we could be talking about. We'll do that at another time. But instead, tonight focuses on the overreaching processes that guide how the issues are addressed in our community. It's about empowering each of us to understand these processes and participate in them actively. Our goal is to ensure these issues that we care about are tackled effectively and in accordance with established rules. And a word to the wise, if we find these rules don't serve us well, we'll learn and understand how our collective voices can lead to meaningful change. And that's what all of us are seeking. So let's gear up to drive change together. The best way to do it is together, ensuring that New Mexico works for all of the people. So it's my great honor tonight to be joined by three of our amazing leaders and elected officials in the New Mexico State Legislature. Please help me welcome Senator Harold Pope Jr., Representative Pamelya Herndon, and Representative Janelle Anyanonu, who we have decided has the most difficult name to pronounce in the entire legislature. But I want to thank you all for being here. And I'd love it if you would just spend a few minutes talking about how you got to the district and, you know, some of the things that you're working on. Can we start with you, Representative Herndon?
Sure, Kathy. Thank you very much. You know, I've lived in my district for almost 30 years. My kids grew up in House District 28. And for years, I had been an advocating for policies for women, for children, and just to lift up families in general. So I had helped Melanie Stansberry run for the position when she came into town to run. And I knocked on doors with her and we talked about strategies. And then when she decided to go to Congress, I decided it was time for me to stop running after people to enact the policies that I've been looking at, but I could enact them myself. And I was mostly looking at trying to make sure that our children are safe, that guns are stored safely and out of the hands of children, that people could afford their prescription drugs, and that they had adequate access to health care. In addition, I wanted to make sure that people had adequate access to mental health care also, whether it was against helping against substance abuse, addiction, or if there were actual mental disorders that people had. So those were the things that I looked at the most. And those are the things that I've been fighting for. And those are the things that you'll see as a result of the work that I do in the New Mexico State Legislature.
Thank you, Representative Herndon, Representative Anyanonu. And so can we pronounce your name?
Yes.
So we're going to do a primer on how to pronounce her name. So you have to pronounce the R, but there's no R in the spelling of her name. You can see it there on the screen. Anyanonu.
Correct.
All right.
Anyanonu.
Anyanonu. So
it is an invisible R.
Yes, and she is our district representative here in District 19.
Yes.
In the heart of the International District.
Absolutely. Yes. I'm so happy to be able to do this program here in 19. It's absolutely wonderful. So I came into politics kind of an unusual way. 2016 was a very eye-opening year for me. I think it was for a lot of people. And I found myself after the election of 2016, honestly, pretty depressed. And about 2 weeks after the election, I realized that I could sit on the couch and stay depressed and tweet into the void forever, or I could get up and affect some of the change that I wanted to see. So I realized that the best way to do that is actually at the local level. I started volunteering for representatives and senators here in New Mexico. I actually had the honor of volunteering for Senator Pope in your very first election. It was 2020. We were kind of stuck on what we could do. We couldn't do door knocking in the traditional way, but signed a lot of postcards for you, and I was very happy to do that. I also joined the Emerge program, learned how to run a campaign, how to be a candidate. And then in 2021, when the seat here in 19 came open, I applied for the appointment process to be the representative here. And when the appointment actually went to Representative Kay Bunka, I was really excited for the district when she got appointed because she is a young woman of color. She is a mother. She has the unique perspective that I wanted to see in the House. I want the House to look as much like the people of New Mexico as it possibly can. So when she got that appointment, I was really happy to see that. And then when she decided not to return, I decided that, now's a good time. I can step up and do an election. I've trained to do that. So I was happy to run. I was happy to win. And I am happy to represent 19.
Thank you so much. And now Senator Pope.
Thank you, Kathy. Senator Harold Pope Jr., and I serve as the caucus majority chair in the Senate, representing Senate District 23, Northwest Albuquerque. I was elected in 2020, ended up making history in doing that and becoming the first African-American state senator ever here in New Mexico. I'm honored to be there and make that history. At the same time, I recognize that there are so many people here in New Mexico that deserve that honor as well, and we're more than qualified to be in this position. I am a transplant from Colorado. I was actually stationed out here. I was serving in the Air Force, and when I came out here in 98 to 02 for college, it was always a plan for me to come back here and live here. Went back on active duty, came back in 2010 and retired in 2018. Was appointed working for Mayor Keller after retirement in 2018, and then decided to run for Senate in 2020. And so my focus in the legislature, a lot of the work that I do is veterans, military family issues, issues with education, because that's what really helped me in my success, and then issues related to, science and technology in our environment. So those are things that I really want to work on. And a lot of times I might not run a bill like many of us, but we sign on. It's really just about getting the work done. It's not always about getting the credit. It's just about getting it done. So thank you.
Thank you guys for being here. And I want to get right into our program because we don't have a lot of time. We're on a very tight schedule, but we want to ensure that everyone sort of understands that we're not talking about issues tonight. There's a lot of things that we could talk about. We're talking about processes, the workings of government. We want to make sure that we explain or zoom out everything that we talk about, give the facts, and then we'll give our elected officials, our panelists that are in the room with us tonight, an opportunity to zoom in and provide some more analysis about their experience with the particular topics that we discuss. In our first segment, we are going to cover the foundations of New Mexico's legislative process. And so to help us with this zoom out and to explain the facts portion, we have invited Adrian Avila. He's a principal fiscal analyst for the New Mexico Legislature's Senate Majority Office. Adrian was born and raised in Albuquerque and is a first-generation American. He spent 4 years as a gifted math educator at a Title I middle school within the Albuquerque Public School District prior to beginning his role with the Senate Majority Office. He is a returned Peace Corps volunteer, thank you so much, who served for over 2 years in the DR, in the Dominican Republic. He's also worked with the Albuquerque refugee population through the UNM Refugee Wellbeing Project and spent 4 years working in healthcare. He's a proud graduate of Valley High School, the University of New Mexico. We love seeing our University of New Mexico graduates come back and do well. He also was at the University of Edinburgh, Central New Mexico Community College, getting his teaching licensure. He's a public health scholar from Columbia University and quantitative sciences scholar from Harvard University. I just looked at all that and I thought, Adrian, we are not worthy. Oh my goodness. Welcome to the panel. We have a few questions that we'd like you to cover in the foundations of government. I learned so much when I was talking to you this week. And we want to just start off with, how is the legislative session organized? So the very first question that we have are, what are the key differences between the 30 and 60-day sessions in the New Mexico legislature? Welcome to the panel. First, I guess we should just let you say hi before you get right into it. How you doing?
Oh, I'm fantastic. It's a beautiful day. I just went for a walk and it's just so nice. It's a nice change of pace from the winter, the bitter cold of the winter. So my name's Adrian Avila, Adrian Avila for all my Latinos out there. So let's focus a little bit real quick on the legislature. So our legislature, our constitution provides the framework of how the legislature works. And within New Mexico, we basically have our legislative sessions every January, and they go either for 30 or 60 days, depending on what year it is. So on odd numbered years, let's say like 2025, that's next year, 2027, 2029, et cetera, that's when we have a 60-day session. And it's during the 60-day session where basically the legislature can work on any piece of legislation. They can focus on revenue, budget. They can look at specific issues impacting their community. And that's when you have the big policy changes. And then the even numbered years, so usually an election year, so 2024, 2026, 2028, those sessions are always 30-day sessions. And they're 30 days, meaning that they have to be really focused and narrow in scope. So those years, you're only technically able, the legislature is only able to look at revenue bills, appropriation bills, and appropriation is one of those fancy words that basically means money, right? It's like, how do you get the money out to the communities? And anything that the governor puts on her call. Now, a call basically means it's like, what are
before we go to the call, I just want to maybe stop there for a second and go to our electeds and just ask a question about, there have been so many people talking about the 30-day session because it seems like it's so short, it's such a quick timeline that maybe there just isn't even a reason to have a 30-day session. I know it's been pretty controversial. Do any of you guys have any comments about that? Because I know it must be pretty hard on you doing all that work in 30 days. Long nights, long days, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is a breakneck pace. This was I'm jumping in first because this was my first 30-day session. So I learned a lot this year. I was in Adrian's office a lot. Hi, thank you so much for your help, Adrian. I really appreciate it. It is a very quick turnaround time to try and get the bills that you care about, which is, every bill that you carry through that entire process and getting the budget passed. It's important work, but yeah, it's hard. It is tough to get through that entire process in just a month.
And I just hear a lot of people saying, why, just do 30 days? Because it seems like, there's too much to do and it should be longer.
I don't have any problem making the session longer. I'm pretty sure, Adrian, you can probably correct me if I'm incorrect on this, but the terms of the session are set in the state constitution. Mm-hmm. So we have discussions yearly about lengthening the session. Those bills come up every year that I've been there, all two of them, that those bills have come up. And I voted for those bills because I think our current way of doing things, while it made sense when, people had ranches to run and were literally coming up to the Capitol on horseback and trying to get this work done when we wrote this Constitution, it made sense then, but it's not necessarily reflective of the most modern way to run a legislature now. But it would take getting the bill passed and also doing a constitutional amendment, which would be a vote by the public. So it's a long road to modernization, but I think we're working on it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's a 30-day session, but we still have to do it. The budget, there still are some important appropriation bills. There still are some bills that the governor puts on a call and sends a message, but you're right. The frustration is so short. And I think a lot of the frustration is, in essence, for some of our legislation, you're really saying that it's going to be heard maybe every 2 years, because if you don't get a message or doesn't fall in that category of an appropriation. So I'd argue for longer sessions. If I had it my way, and I could change the rules. Once again, we have to pass a bill. The voters have to approve that in a constitutional amendment. I'd rather see 2 60-day sessions, maybe, with no need for a governor's call, to where we could just bring any legislation. But that's not the system we have constitutionally. So
let's go back to a zoom out to Adrian. What does being on the governor's call for the legislature mean, and how does this process work?
Yeah, so the governor's call is basically the governor providing policy goals, right? And they basically issue what could be seen as a letter directed towards the Senate and to the House, saying, this is what I'm looking at, this is what I would like to see the legislature accomplish. So that could be something like housing, which is something she put on the call this year. And it just ranges. So every year it's something else, depending on what is important and policy goal that she would like to see accomplished. She, as the governor, is very much receptive to the needs of the community. So the communities can bring up issues to the governor, and the governor can consider those items for a message to add that onto the call. The process for that, it works throughout the entire interim, and we'll discuss the interim in a little bit, but basically as things come up, because things don't just happen during the 30 or 60 days of the legislative session, they happen year round. So as things come up and the governor becomes aware of them, she might put it as a priority. So it's definitely something to look into, but basically the governor's call only happens during those 30-day sessions during even numbered years. And they also basically happen if she calls a special session, which sometimes occurs, sometimes doesn't. But that's the basics behind the governor's call.
You guys have anything to add
basically
about the
a
governor's
power
call?
that she has.
The interesting part about the governor's call is that we have this interim session that begins usually around April. So right about now, we're getting ready for an interim committee meetings that will be occurring, starting with the Legislative Finance Committee on April 17th, for example. And so you get a chance to sort of ferret out the things that you want to make sure the governor knows are important. And even though she gets to determine the call, sometimes you can influence her on things that should be considered important and decided on a 30-day session. So I just want to bring that out also. And if there is a special session, it's also important to note that legislators can call a special session also by an appropriate number of votes presented by the legislature, and we don't have to wait on the governor if there's something we think we need to bring back.
Okay. Go ahead.
And I would just say, for example, we did do, I'm forgetting, I think it was after the 21 session or the 22 session, we didn't get it done in the normal session, but we had a special session for cannabis, right? And so that was an example of, we came back, the call and the message from the governor was on cannabis, recreational cannabis legalization. And so when we came back, that was the only thing that we could work on in a special.
Okay.
And then, of course, we went back and did another special session when we did the rebate checks and the junior bill. Remember, we went back for that. So just want to give a few examples of how that works on a special session.
Really great. I think that's a really good segue to go back to Adrian. We don't have a full-time legislature, but there are a lot of meetings in between the annual legislative session and called interim committees. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about what are those interim committees and why are they important? We heard a little bit from Representative Herndon and Senator Pope about the importance of those committees. But can you tell us what they're intended to do? How many of them are there?
Yeah, of course. So the interim committees are basically either created by law and exist within statute, or are created through the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council is composed of leadership within the legislature. and they happen to be one of the committees that are created by statute. Now, in terms of the total number of interim committees, there's a total of 21 for this upcoming year. 13 of them exist through law, 8 of them exist through approval or creation by the Legislative Council. Now, these range in issues, and each one has a very narrow focus, with the exception of the Legislative Finance Committee, which kind of has to look at everything. So these committees can focus on education. Some of them will focus on Indian affairs. Others might look at the water and natural resources of the state. So as each one narrows down the policy area, the Legislative Finance Committee connects with those and kind of looks at what the policy goals, what the legislature is kind of looking at, and then develops a budget based on what those committees' works or focus have been. So that's kind of the overview of those committees. And they, like Representative Herndon mentioned, they start here in April. So the interim technically starts planning right after the session ends. The work plans for each committee get developed. In April, the first ones tend to meet. Most of them start meeting in July, is usually for some of the smaller committees. But they do the work of the legislature and looking at possible policy changes, looking at priorities for communities, seeing what needs to change within the law, and seeing the effects of laws that they did pass and seeing if there needs to be tweaks. So that's kind of the purpose of the interim committee process. It's vetting legislation or potential legislation that could come up during the legislative session. So when something magically appears during the legislative session that hasn't gone through the interim process, it might raise a few flags, right? Because it could be that it wasn't fully vetted and it could clash with existing law, which would be problematic on multiple levels. But that's the overview of the interim committees.
Let me just ask you, so how would the citizenry learn about these interim committees and when they meet? And I understand they meet around the state, right? So it's not just in Santa Fe. And then also, are they available on Zoom? Can people sign up for public comment? Like, what happens there?
Of course. So on the New Mexico legislative website, and it's NMBLC.gov. Again, nmlegis.gov. On that website, there's a little tab that says committees, and it'll have a committee calendar. And that calendar will tell you where all the committees are going to be. And each committee will have a work plan. And on the work plan, it'll identify where they're going to be. On that same webpage, you can actually look at what's happening, and you can see on a weekly basis, it's like what's coming up. So if a certain committee is going to meet, it'll tell you where, when, it'll have a Zoom link, or at least a link to see the webcast live. And it'll also point out the agenda. What are they going to be looking at? And if it's something that a community member or an organization or another legislator is interested in, they can always reach out directly to that committee, and there'll be usually contact information on there to request to either attend or to comment, or potentially, it'll have the address of where they're meeting. So you can literally go and sit in the audience at any of these meetings because they're all open to the public. And depending on the committee and if there's time, they'll actually allow public comment on certain pieces of whatever they're covering. So again, nmlegis.gov, or you can just Google New Mexico legislative website and it'll take you there. So depending on what you're interested in, I highly recommend you attend those.
And so did you say that you could also join via Zoom or an online platform?
Sometimes. It depends on the committee and depends on the committee chair.
Okay, I won't ask you why they don't all have that. I won't ask you that. We'll ask it. We'll hold that for the next time. But I want to go to the elected to ask you each, which committees do you serve on and what do they do?
So I'll begin, Kathy. I sit on the Legislative Health and Human Services Committee, and what we deal with are all things health care, and whether it's mental health or whether it's access to doctors. And we also look at the fact of how do we keep how do we make sure that we have enough medical professionals within our state? I also sit as a member of the Appropriations Committee. So in that committee, we look at how a budget is going to be put together, which items are going to be put into a budget. And the Appropriations Committee is, funneled into what is called the Legislative Finance Committee during the summer as an interim committee, because the House Appropriations Committee does not exist as a single committee by itself during the interim. So that is not one of the 21 that Adrian talked about. So I get to look at how money is going to be spent, where is it going to be spent, and I look at the healthcare of the people of New Mexico.
Okay. Representative Anyanonu.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes. I serve on 5 committees, so I have to run through them kind of quickly.
Okay.
I serve on the Legislative Interim Ethics Committee. We actually only meet once. We have an organizational meeting in the Roundhouse where we just talk about the process of what we will do in the event of an ethics complaint arising during the interim. And that is ethics complaints that occur within the legislature that we deal with. And then we don't meet again unless something goes really sideways. I also serve on Science and Technology. Super fun committee because we have a lot of science and tech in the state. We spend a lot of time in Los Alamos. We go down south all over the state with that committee. Also on the Economic and Rural Development Committee. Courts, Corrections, and Justice. And lastly, I am an advisory member on MFA Oversight, which meets with the Mortgage Finance Authority, and they just report to us on how their contracts with smaller agencies, organizations go, and they just kind of tell us what they're up to. So those are my 5 committees. They're really exciting. They're a lot of fun.
How many meetings is that?
So theoretically, that is 4 meetings a month, unless ethics has to meet for some reason.
Okay. All right. So again, you can go to nmlegis.gov to find out where all these interim committees are. Senator Pope?
Thank you. I serve on 6 interim committees,
Oh, my goodness.
but I'm able to do that being a retired military guy and have a little bit of time, and I bought enough suits that I can afford to do it.
Well,
so
you
far.
know, like we got to talk about the suit now. We do. It's kind of fabulous.
I know, and Adrian, usually he's got a decent suit game, but he's kind of casual tonight. But
Oh,
I'll
wow.
let it slide. I'll let it slide.
No, it's fabulous.
Yeah. So I serve as this year I'll be the chair of Military and Veterans Affairs Committee. And so one thing that folks need to know as well, usually the chair, it's either there'll be co-chairs or sometimes there'll be a chair and vice chair, and they'll flip-flop from the House member to the Senate member. And so that happens as well. So folks need to kind of know that happens as well.
Okay.
So last year, Representative Harry Garcia ran the military and veterans, and then I'll be the chair this year, and I was the vice chair last year.
Oh my
So
goodness.
I'll do
Isn't that like, I mean, that must be just amazing for you being a vet.
Yeah.
To be a chair of that committee.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
work on these issues, and we go to different parts of the states, a lot of the veterans organizations, and just talk about the issues, especially, housing, healthcare, a lot of these issues with the VA. So
Mhm.
important work. I also serve on the Legislative Education Study Committee. And so this is the work that we're really doing through the interim, visiting communities, talking with superintendents, talking with members of the school districts on how we can improve education in our state. So this is huge. And LESC makes a lot of recommendations to the LFC on the budget. So that's a very important committee. I also serve on the Revenue Stabilization and Tax Policy Committee, where we're
Now that
really
sounds a little boring.
it sounds boring, but
Yeah.
it's so important when we talk about what do we do with GRT, what do we do with tax
GRT,
incentives,
so
when we talk
gross
about
receipts
credits,
tax,
yes,
yeah.
gross receipts tax, right? A lot of these tax policy issues in our state. So that's where a lot of these discussions are happening, because once we get to the session, we just don't haphazardly make a determination of what we're going to do in our tax package, right? A lot of this is being discussed and worked during this committee. The next, I'm on the Science and Technology, which Janelle talked about. I'm on that committee as well. And then I'm an advisor on 2 other committees, the Legislative Human Health and Human Services Committee with Representative Herndon. And then I'm on the Radioactive and Hazardous Materials Committee, really dealing with waste cleanup, whether oil and gas or, nuclear waste, and just really protecting our environment. So we do a lot of that work on the committee. One addition I want to make on these committees, there's leadership in these committees, either a chair, vice chair, or co-chairs. There's also, you can be a member where you're like a voting member. And there's also like advisory members where you're on the committee, but you don't have voting power. And so there's different roles for some members in these committees. And
Do
so
you have
that's
voting
important as well.
power on?
Well, on two of the committees, Health and Human Services and Radioactive Hazardous Materials, I do not. And so that happens sometimes. My first year I was on LFC. I was not a voting member, but I was advisory and I went. But so you still get to be there. You're still part of the committee, but certain committees, it takes a while to get on, and there's some seniority and folks that have been on there for a while. So, everybody wants to get on LFC. A lot of times there's some interim committees that they don't have a problem having members want to serve. So.
Okay. Yeah. So everybody wants to talk about money, right? So that's a good segue for us to talk about money. And Adrian, we're going to go back to you so that we could get some information on what is the legislature's appropriating power and what is the timeline for process for developing the budget? Because it seems like as soon as the 2024 legislative session ended, we're already into 2025. So we're not waiting till the next legislative session.
Yeah, so let's talk money, right? I mean, if
Do
we're
you know that
talking
song,
budget,
by the way?
just
Do you
to
know the
get
song?
everyone perspective, right? This last legislative session, the legislature approved $10.2 billion with a B in recurring expenditure for the state. So that's how much money is being pumped into the schools, the health systems, basically anything and every service that the state provides directly. And then on top of that, another $3 billion roughly was appropriated for non-recurring, so one-time expenditures. So that includes your roads, that includes so many other one-time expenses throughout the state. So that's the scope of how big this budget is.
So you said
that's why it's important to
13 billion?
understand-
13 billion.
Go ahead.
Did you say $13 billion?
Billion, yeah, we're
All
talking
right.
billion, big money. We're talking big money.
Right.
So basically the budget itself is presented through what's referred to as House Bill 2, and that's the General Appropriation Act. And that's the actual legislation they passed during the session. However, to be able to make that bill happen, it's a 365-day job to make it happen. So to give everyone perspective, the second the session ends, work begins for the next year's budget. So during the spring, all of the agencies throughout the state government are not only preparing how to spend the money that was just approved, but they start planning for next year's budget and what they want to possibly request. So they start thinking years ahead, right? It's not a right now at this moment. It's like, let's think into the future. What are our future needs? So agencies might start looking for proposals right now in the spring to potentially receive funding that won't officially start until July 2025, right? So it's almost a year plus thinking ahead. During the summer, the agencies vet all these plans. They prepare their long-term vision and they vet their proposals and prepare a budget request. And statutorily, by law, all the agencies by September 1st need to provide the Department of Finance and Administration within the executive branch and the Legislative Finance Committee within the legislature their request. This is how much money we believe we need for the next fiscal year, right? And these are all the things we think we're going to do in terms of special one-time expenses, and they start preparing all that for us. So that's September 1st. During the fall and winter, the Legislative Finance Committee and then the executive branch vets all of these proposals. And they start looking, it's like, oh, that makes sense. Maybe we need more money here. Oh, that's not something that's really fleshed out. Well, give us more information. Let's build on this idea. Is this evidence-based? Will it actually make a difference? Let's do the research to find out if that works. And then basically, by early January, before the session starts, before the first day, 99% of the budget is done, right? And that's something that most people don't understand because it's been 300 some days of work that has gone into preparing the budget already, seeing what the agencies truly need and all that. And then you shift to the session, and that's when the legislature starts looking. It's like, okay, we have different proposals coming our way. This is what the agency wants. This is what the executive branch, aka the governor, thinks the agency actually needs, whether they agree with the agency's number or maybe more, maybe less. And then this is what the Legislative Finance Committee recommends, which, as was mentioned, the Legislative Finance Committee is composed of members from both the House and the Senate, and it's bipartisan.
Okay. So in this Citizens Academy, Adrian, it looks like everything's already done by the time we get to the session. Is that true?
Most of it, but that's the
you said
background
99%.
work. The actual decision of what to do is done during the session.
Okay.
But unraveling the entire budget is incredibly difficult, which is why it's like with the legislative session, it's like, here are options. How do you want to go? What's the path forward? And if there's a new vision that comes up, it's like, okay, something new's come up out of these paths. Where do you want to remove funding to shift it to this new priority? Right? So it becomes a balancing act because the Constitution requires a balanced budget, and there's no way around that. And that basically means the amount of money the state's going to receive in through tax revenue, that's the maximum that the state is able to spend. We are not allowed to take out debt without it having a committed revenue source. So you need to have everything balanced. Every penny needs to be accounted for in some way, shape, or form. And that's the difficult part, right? So when budget's already at the legislature, it's like, all right, we're looking at housing, we're looking at the environment, we're looking at roads. It's like, all right, how do we balance this out? And that's the critical and difficult decision that the finance committees have to make within the legislature. And then the full chamber has to agree, right? It's like, is this a good way forward or is it not? And that's the difficult part.
Thank you for that timeline. I want to let everyone know that we will have this timeline available on our website. We'll send it out because now is the time to start to influence the legislation. And I'm not really sure that I ever actually had seen this timeline. So we want to make sure that it gets distributed far and wide. And it brings us kind of to the next question, because you talked about 10 plus billion that is for the recurring expenditures for the state, but then there's about another 3 billion that is about the non-recurring funds. And so that would be the capital outlay process and for public infrastructure. And I want to know if that's the same as the GROW funds. I'm still trying to figure out what GROW means. I know that was something that was new this year. And then there used to be junior funds. Can you just help to, kind of unravel all of that for us? Because that's about $3+ billion, right?
Yeah, so capital outlay, growth funds, and what used to be junior are part of the 3 billion. The whole 3 billion is spent far and wide on many things that can be on, putting things into reserve, paying for pensions. Like, it's a one-time expenditure or injection of money in some way, shape, or form. So this year, the capital outlay process was about $1 billion. So out of the 3 billion, 1 billion was dedicated to the capital outlay process. And capital outlay basically means money that the state is investing on its state infrastructure or local government infrastructure. That does not necessarily mean it's used on roads. That's usually a different pot of money. However, at the local level, the legislator might want to put some money towards a certain road if it's a priority for them. So the capital outlay process actually starts beginning, depending on what you're doing now, for next year. So, for example, the Department on Aging is currently, right now in April, has a deadline for anyone who's applying for capital outlay if you want to use them as a agent. And so if you're dealing with the senior center or something along those lines, like that money, their processes right now, and their applications are closing this month. Now, in terms of using a potential fiscal agent, the fiscal agent is a fancy way of saying, the local government is going to serve as my money person. They're going to help me make sure that the money's spent properly and just make sure that I get paid and serve as that pass through to ensure there's a level of accountability. And that's what allows us to flow money to potentially private entities, so nonprofits or non-government organizations. So the capital outlay process to become a fiscal agent for most counties, for most cities and municipalities or council of governments, that's usually in the fall. And all of those entities provide training. Just Google the name of the entity you work with or live in and look that. Type in capital outlay right after, and you will get a link to their training, their process, and that'll break things down for you. Now, in terms of actually submitting a request, the deadline consistently, without fail, to apply to the legislature for potential capital outlay funding is always the week before the session starts. It could be Thursday, it could be the Friday, it could be the Monday, but it's always the week before. So a good rule of thumb is if you're going to apply for capital outlay funding after you've done the legwork of working with a fiscal agent, right? Apply in December, all right? Because once that application closes, it's closed, right? So you missed out on that opportunity.
Okay.
So that's kind of capital outlay. We can dive into more detail at another time because that's an entire huge process of making sure the money can flow out. You need audits, you need a lot of accountability. And then let me shift over to GROW. So GROW stands for Government Results and Opportunity. And it's a new trust fund that was basically created during this last legislative session. That from this trust fund, 25% of whatever balance is in that fund is going to be bumped into GROW, into a program fund to actually expand and use in some way, shape, or form. And the minimum amount that's allowed to flow out is $100 million. That'll flow out for either local communities or if state agencies have kind of a multi-year pilot project. Now, this is the modern version of the junior bill. The junior bill, formerly called the Supplemental Appropriation Act, is basically a bill that was separate from the 10.2 billion, right? It was just a small bill that carried a lot of local projects, local priorities for legislators. So this is kind of the evolution of that. We're trying to make it into something that is more accountable and provides a longer, steady potential funding stream. Now, in terms of the future of how this fund is going to be used, that has yet to be determined. The legislature this upcoming session is going to make some critical decisions on how that funding is going to be spent. This year, the decision was made to appropriate some to allow legislators to pick certain projects that they want to see funded over the next 2 years. So here's so much money, let's say 160,000 for this one purpose. And the entity who receives that money can spend it over 2 years to accomplish that mission. Will it look like that next year? No one knows. And the likelihood of anyone knowing earlier than January, it's hard to say because there's a lot of moving factors on that front.
Okay. And I know that
the reason it changes.
I'm sorry, Adrian, you sent us a manual about capital outlay that we posted in our Zoom chat. We'll put it on the social media. You can find it on our website. If you just have some spare time and you want to learn about capital outlay, there is a manual that's going to tell you all about it. So you can find it on our website and on our social media feeds.
Exactly. And one other thing about that manual also at the very, very back has a link to federal resources. So remember, if your organization or whoever you're working with needs funding in some way, shape, or form, the state might be able to provide some, local governments might be able to provide some, but big money comes from the federal government. So we have a link there to connect people to those sources as well.
Really great. I'm going to turn it over to the electeds for Zoom In, Capital Outlay, Grow, Junior. Discuss.
Okay, I guess I'll start. GRO, since this is the first year we've done this, was really exciting. I don't know how else to phrase it, because we were all learning together, and that was part of my running in and out of Adrian's office about 8 times in a single hour, asking, do we do this? Do we do this? Now what do I do? So that was pretty exciting. Capital, from the perspective of a legislator, I will just give you a really brief story of the first time I ever did capital outlay. So this was 2022. In the 60-day session, I go to my office and there is a phone book thick stack of paper of just capital requests statewide. And the first thing I did is I flipped it open. I found Bernalillo County. I ripped it out and I put everything else in the recycling because my district is here in the middle of town. I wanted to make sure that as much of my capital outlay funding went to the district as possible. And then I grabbed a highlighter and I went through now, instead of what was a yellow pages size book of requests, is now maybe about half the size of the white pages for folks who remember what those look like.
I was going to say, nobody has a phone book anymore. What are you doing?
Phone books looks like. But it's got it down to about a stack of paper about half an inch thick. And I busted out my highlighter and I found every instance where it said I could find the words international district, and I highlighted it. And then after I did that, I went through and read each request more carefully, highlighted the ones that were of interest to me. And then from there, you have to parse down what can you fund to an effective degree. You know, you don't want to just give your capital outlay out in drips and drabs where nothing is actually going to get done, you know, so you have to be really specific and intentional about how you distribute your funding.
Okay. Anyone else? Representative Herndon?
Of course, you know, one of the things that I looked at, in addition to looking at my district, is I also wanted to know how things would be, or how my money could be utilized to benefit the state in general. And housing is a particularly interesting issue. There are too many people who don't have access to quality, affordable housing. And I looked for ways in which we could make sure that we were building upon that. And that was one specific way that I utilized my capital money, remembering that capital means it will last more than a year, and it's a long-term investment. I also looked at schools, and again, safety was a big issue. Schools sometimes needed to have a fencing placed around them so that they could make sure that individuals had no opportunity to enter. So I also took a look at that, and then also making sure that people are able to go to arts and participate in the arts that our state has to offer. So that was hugely important to me. And I look at places like Explorer, or I look at the Museum of History, and how they are presenting programs for our students that they don't get in school otherwise. So those are some of the ways that I looked at capital outlay, in addition to what my colleague, Representative Anyanonu.
All together, Anyanonu.
That's why I'm calling her Janelle.
Right. I think you can just say Representative Janelle.
Not trying to disrespect her.
Right.
And so I would just add, and I want to bring this discussion about, because sometimes there's discussion about, are we doing capital outlay the right way? And when I say that is, right now, it's distributed to senators and representatives in their district. And, you know, they're basically making decisions in their district on where that capital outlay should go. And I think we do a good job at it. But the struggle sometimes is having enough money to make sure that you fully fund your project. Because you don't want to fund something and then it's sitting there for 2-3 years waiting to get fully funded. And so sometimes there is a discussion made, should it be done in a different way, to where we just have capital outlay statewide and we maybe rack and stack state projects? But then the argument might be that maybe there wouldn't be anything, you know, how do you fight for your district? So it's really, there's benefits There's good and bad with doing it that way. And so what I will say is, I know with the representatives that overlap in my district, and I know our representatives here work with their senators as well to just try to see when they see something on the list, how do they fully fund it? So it gets done, because right now there are some projects that have been sitting there for a few years because they aren't fully funded. They're not able to finish. On the other hand, we have had inflation. We have had increases in supplies to where now folks have to put more money in it to complete these projects. I also want to add that the governor also has capital outlay, and so sometimes there are discussions during the session to see what she wants to fund, and we can kind of work together to make sure that we can cover a project.
Okay, and I think it's important to note that you have to both provide projects within your district, and then you also need to think about what's happening over the entire, state.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example in my district, right, on Northwest, right? And so I have my district, right, but there are folks on the west side that might have some services or stuff that get done in Senator Duhig's district, right? That's just not my district, but it's on the west side. Or there might be something that's downtown or in the city that might be something that serves youth citywide, but there's nothing on the west side. So there's sometimes where I'm going to help and fund that as well, because it still serves people in my district, even though it's not in my district. So those are things that we look at as well.
Thank you, guys. And that brings us to a real subject that we got to go back to Adrian for, which is the anti-donation clause, because that has an effect on all of these non-recurring funds. So we need to understand the anti-donation clause. My understanding is that New Mexico has a unique interpretation of the anti-donation clause. Can you tell us what is it? Why is it? What do we do about it?
Yeah. That's the other $1 million question here, right? So the anti-donation clause is a clause within the New Mexico Constitution, and it's been there since the state's founding. And it was modeled off of other anti-donation clauses of other states. So if everyone remembers, right, New Mexico was one of the last states to join the United States. So it got to implement a constitution that learned from, errors of other states' constitutions. So the anti-donation clause was added to ensure that the state didn't spend, the people's tax dollars on just corporate interests, right? So if you look back at the robber barons and, big corporate interests from the 1900s and the 1800s, those were all the things that the founders of the New Mexico Constitution were aware of. And that's why this clause came into effect. Now, over the years, this is one of those clauses that's been constantly challenged in the court. It's like, but does it mean this? Can this qualify? Can that? And it's been challenged 30 times within our Supreme Court. And it's been also amended multiple times by the public. They've accepted certain amendments to the anti-donation clause over the years. And basically, the anti-donation clause now has a certain number of exceptions, right? Things that don't really count. So the state can actually put that money towards certain things and it wouldn't count as an anti-donation. So those things that are exemptions include providing care and maintenance for the sick and indigent people. So that's what allows the state to fund hospitals directly, right? Because they're providing that care to the sick and the indigent. That's what allows us to fund housing, right? So those are examples of what that exemption created. Other exemptions that are in there are, for example, veteran scholarships. So a scholarship, technically, it's a gift. So with this exemption, that's what enables the state to provide scholarships. Loans to nurses, and funding for anything under the Local Economic Development Act, also referred to as LEDA. So LEDA is something that provides funding for new businesses or to provide job training for businesses, scale workers up. So that's that. And then affordable housing, of course, is the other exemption. Now, something to keep in mind, the anti-donation clause is the primary reason why the state can't directly just fund, let's say, this non-government organization. They're doing amazing work in whatever field it is. It's like the state can't just give you money to continue that work, right? It's because you are a non-government entity, and in being a non-government entity, the government doesn't control you, doesn't have any accountability over how you actually spend the money, and there's no real transparency in comparison to money that the government has to spend, right? Because there's a lot of checks and balances within government. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, with capital or with grow or anything like that, if you happen to be outside of the scope of government, aka a nonprofit, a non-government entity, you need a fiscal agent. You need a government to kind of oversee that funding, or a local government to help out in order to receive those state dollars. On top of that, right, it's one of the reasons why agencies require contracts, right? They need to be able to reach out and be like, all right, on this contract, these were the conditions and you're not meeting them, so we're not going to continue paying for something if you're not delivering the service. So the key to that, and the way those contracts, don't run afoul of the anti-donation clause, is because the state is getting something in return. That's the key to all of this. It's like, is the state receiving a benefit, right? It's basically quid pro quo is the simplest way to put it. It's like, if the state is receiving something for what it's paying for, then it's worth it. And here's the contract, here's the financial controls, here's the transparency that we need. So that's kind of the background behind the anti-donation clause.
This, I was told that this could be an entire segment. We're going to do a whole segment on the anti-donation clause and capital outlay process in another part of the series. But we have a couple of minutes before we have to end this segment and go to the top of the hour. We're going to thank 99.9 The Beat for streaming live. Thanks, Byron Padrell. And so I want to just maybe give one of you guys choose who is going to talk a little bit about, the anti-donation clause and how it affects your work.
So I'll jump in real quick. I would say it doesn't affect my work specifically, but we've seen the barriers and the issue with the anti-donation clause with the pandemic, with COVID, right? Mm-hmm. Specifically, because there were a lot of nonprofits, a lot of NGOs to where we had some funding, we wanted to get it out, and we couldn't directly give it to that nonprofit or give it to that individual. And so that was a perfect example where we saw that barrier.
All right, we got to go to the station break for the top of the hour. We'll be dark for about 30 seconds. All right, welcome back. Thank you, Adrian. He was truly amazing. And, I told him that, we're just going to call him every day and ask questions because he knows everything. And so now we're going to go into segment 2, where it's titled From Ideas to Action, Getting Your Voice Heard. And I've got some of the best people who know how to get their voices heard coming up in this next segment. And so we talked about, how is the legislator made up? What's the format? What are the tasks? Now we're going to talk about how does the citizenry go to the legislature to get your voice heard. I want to welcome to the panel Marilyn Hill. She was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She received a master's in public administration and a bachelor of business administration from New Mexico State University, another homegrown New Mexican. She had an extensive, diverse, and happy career in state and local governments. She was the deputy state treasurer, deputy cabinet secretary for several departments, and the village administrator, city manager for the village of Corrales. Marilyn is the president of a family-owned corporation and enjoys, she says, semi-retirement. She's an author, inventor, and the nana to 3 delightful granddaughters. She loves to read, write, and travel with her granddaughters and her family. Welcome, Marilyn Pettis. And then we've got Stephanie Maez, who has over 20 years of nonprofit public and private sector experience. Maez has a track record of supporting and leading efforts to drive systemic change through advocacy, strategic communications, community engagement, and philanthropy. She's a senior fellow for the Topos Partnership, previously worked as an executive director for Progress Now New Mexico, CEO for the Center for Civic Policy, and served in former Governor, beloved, belated Governor New Mexico, Governor Richardson administration. She was a state legislator, and as a state legislator, she sponsored and supported a slate of innovative community-based policy proposals. She's got a master's degree in public administration. She's got a whole lot of stuff on her resume, and she's done a whole lot of stuff in terms of strategic communications now as a consultant, and we're happy to welcome her to the panel, Stephanie Maez. And I'm proud to have 2 women that I'm just lucky to be able to say that I get to work with them as colleagues. And I brought them on to talk about how, as a community organization, they get their voices heard at the state legislature. And so we've got Monet Silva, who is the executive director for the New Mexico Commission to End Homelessness, and Alexandria Taylor, who is the executive director of the New Mexico Coalition for Sexual Assault Programs. Welcome, Monet and Alexandria, and Marilyn and Stephanie. How y'all doing?
Doing great. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Learning so much. Isn't it amazing how even after 20, 30 years, we can still learn? This last hour has been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I learned so much, and I think we got to all approach this kind of with a beginner's mind, right? It's like every time it's going to be dynamic and different, so we got to keep learning. How you doing, Monet and Alexandria?
Doing well. How are you doing, Kathy?
Doing great. So good to see you. So I'm gonna jump right in. We have about 20 minutes for this session to talk about, first of all, how can community organizations and individuals effectively influence legislation and agendas? I want, to hear from both perspectives, from, both sides, like if you were, coming from a department, Marilyn, as you used to be a member, a cabinet secretary, what did you want community members to do to get to you? Because we saw what that tight timeline is. If you could talk about it from that perspective, and maybe all of you just kind of jump in. I want this to be just really interactive. And so we'll start with you, Marilyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. It was very interesting for me to work in state government and then also try to introduce legislation, because working in state government, basically what you're doing is defending or testifying with information about a bill. You mentioned, oh my gosh, who would want to be on the Revenue Stabilization and Tax Policy Committee? When I worked at tax, that was almost like my life, working at Res Staff, because everything that had any revenue impact went through that committee. And so we were there to talk about how that was going to affect the budget. And as Adrian mentioned, that's where the bulk of the money comes from for state use. So it was actually a fascinating committee. But from the government side, when people would bring legislation forward, and we looked at it, our number one priority was to determine how it was going to affect the money and whether or not there was enough money to deal with it. So there were a lot of committees that had to go through, a lot of testimony that had to come up. And as a person that worked at tax, we didn't really have an opinion per se, whether it was good or bad legislation. Our job was primarily to talk about how it was going to affect the revenues. So from that perspective, that was actually a safe place to be, is just to talk about, is it good only in terms of spending the revenue and what effect would it have? In a lot of cases, there were unintended consequences when there's legislation dealing with situations. Now, when I went forward with a bill for a nonprofit, that was actually a very exciting thing to do, because as you've heard about from Adrian and some other ones, you have to get started early if you're going to try to affect change. One of the first things to do is, if you want a law or to have a strategy for something, would be to see if there's already something on the books. Is there something in Mexico? Is there something in another state? You don't want to reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. So you look to see if there's some legislation, and I love nmlegis.gov because you can find all sorts of things. You can find it by subject. You don't have to know the bill number. You can find by subject, go and look for it. For example, anti-hazing. That was one of the issues that my organization was looking at. There was already something on the books, but it didn't address specifically what we needed it to. So when you get to that, you look at it and decide what you want to change. And then you also have to figure out who in the legislature might be a sponsor or proponent for your idea. So you have to have some background on who these people might be and go forward and speak to them. It is a long process. And I think that through this conversation, we found that it's not going to just happen in a 60-day session. It may take you years to accomplish what you want, but you get your draft legislation, talk to your sponsor. There may be changes, there may be things that they may agree to or not, and then you try to go forward with your bill. And I think in the next session, we're going to be talking about how long it takes, or some of the others might talk about how long it's going to take, what happens to the bill when it finally gets to a bill, which is an amazing place to be, what happens at that point. So that would be some of the comments that I would make.
Let's go to you next, Stephanie.
Thank you for that, Marilyn. I think that's the theme that I've heard throughout the last 70 minutes that we've been on together, is that this work, so much of it is happening in the interim. It's happening outside of the Roundhouse, and it's happening at the state level and the local level. It's happening among community organizations and with individuals who really care about these issues. And I think one thing I'd like to lift up is that, what Marilyn said about not reinventing the wheel and identifying other allies and stakeholders that might care about an issue that you care about, and thinking about how you can come together in coalition and collaborate and become partners, because I think we're stronger together and have more influence and power inside the building when we're together and we're organizing outside the building. So I think, to kind of summarize, I'm really interested in Alexandria and Monet's thoughts too. But I really think the organizing piece of the work in your communities, talking with your neighbors and your friends and your family about these issues, and really, I think lifting up the fact that we have power together. And I think that we don't often see it because it feels so inaccessible. And that's one thing, Cathy, one reason why I just love your organization and love this series that you're doing, because I think as we realize that power more and more, we become, more powerful together. And so that's one piece. The other piece I would say is, and then I'm going to stop, but is thinking about how to build relationships with influencers in the Roundhouse, with staff, with members of the House and Senate, with state, key state employees. That those relationships are critical, and those happen too outside of the dates of the legislative session. So, thank you.
Thank you, Monet.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Okay, I hate to be the one that asked that question, but I wasn't sure if my mic was working. I think that I'll say ditto to what Stephanie just said. Building coalition is a huge thing. I think that the more force you can show up with during the interim, during the session, to speak with the legislators is really, really key, and making it understood that this is not something that's just a need of your organization, but you're looking at things right across the state or within your city, your county, whatever it is that you're looking for. And then actually something else that Stephanie just said is, making friends and knowing people in the Roundhouse and that are part of this process. And I'm just going to kind of highlight Alexandria. Just watching her, right? She talks to everybody from the janitors to the monitors in the rooms. Like, she knows everybody in there and really, lifts them up that what they're doing is important to what we're doing as well. And so I think that that's really key as well.
So are you ruling the Roundhouse, Alexandria? What you doing?
I'm getting to know everybody. We're in them halls, so we're gonna hang out and we're gonna love on everybody and take care of everybody, because we are in halls of power that have an effect on your spirit, especially because all of us here are working on policy issues that impact ourselves and our communities and the people that we love. And so we're spreading love and we're taking care of each other and making sure that as we do this hard work for 30 and 60 days in those halls, that we are well together. I think I honor everything that everybody has said here, and I honor our esteemed electeds, right, whose representation means so much in our legislature, but which nobody has said is unpaid work. Mm-hmm. And so you just heard from the three of them that they are working year round, doing full-time work to make our multiple billion-dollar budget, to get policy for New Mexicans, to build our state, and it is unpaid. And so as an advocate, when we're looking, and I agree, I have a sticky note here on my monitor that says building a relational infrastructure. Everything about our work has to be deeply relational, building deep connection and coalition to examine what we're going to bring forward. But also, when we're asking one of our electeds to carry a bill for us, I feel it is one of our responsibilities to come with data-informed requests, with a level of expertise, because we can't ask them to be the masters of everything they're asked to represent for us. And so to come having built coalition, to come having done the research and the homework, to know what some of the pros and cons are, to know what some of the cost-benefit analysis are, as Marilyn said, what maybe some of those unintended consequences can be, and then to also work with state agencies and others in the development of those policies so that there's not surprises when we get there, but that when we get there, we can say, yes, we consulted with this department. Yes, we have the governor's eyes on this. Yes, we've built deep coalition around this, and to ensure that we have as many people at the table. I actually want to know what actually might kill a piece of legislation just as much as I want to know who's supporting the legislation, right? Mm-hmm. And so I really think that in community and in our advocacy work, we really should be of service to those who are serving in these elected positions as well, because their job is so major.
Thank you for that. And I guess, we want to just sort of move to the next question, which is, like, how can just the average citizen get to a state department and bring their programming ideas to the attention of those, director? You got to go talk to the cabinet secretary. Can I do that as just Joe Blow citizen, Marilyn?
Absolutely. Now, whether or not, let me speak from my experience. I was always willing to listen to what people said, because things change, technology changes. And so if anyone had any ideas, I was willing to listen. And a lot of the agencies have public officers and different divisions where you can actually go and talk to people. For example, at one of the agencies that I worked for, they had committees. They had a lot of boards and commissions, that was a fun place to be. So you could go to the commission meetings and express your concern about certain things. So yes, I think that you can do that. I think that as someone mentioned, be focused on what you want to go with. Don't go with a lot of nonsense. Go with your facts, your figures, who's supporting you, and make sure that it makes sense. Not just because you don't want to pay taxes on a certain thing. What's the real reason you're going forward with a particular situation? And one of the things that I would also say is that when your bill, if you're fortunate enough to have your bill get to the committees, support the committees, because our legislators there, they are speaking on behalf of an interest that you might like. It's very important to be in the committee. And with revenue stabilization, people had lots of comments about why something should or should not be taxed, what should be exempted, what should be a deduction. So having people go and speak to that makes a difference. And I think that our legislators can also comment that they want to hear what people have to say, because the public might bring up ideas and questions that they may not have thought of. So that is a very important process also of getting bills through, is listening to the constituents who come to committee meetings.
Thank you so much. And so I'm going to go, to the rest of you, just to answer that question. How do you, let's say I don't know anybody. How can I get my idea heard? How about you?
Call someone.
How about you, Monet?
Look on nmlegis.gov. Someone in your district, that's usually the best place. Find out who serves in your district, in your area, find your representative, find your senator, try to spend some time with them. As they have town halls, they've done that after the session to give an update on what has happened in the session. It's a perfect opportunity to go meet them and speak to them about particular things. So that is a very good place to start.
Thanks. Monet?
I agree with that. I think as well, just as Adrian said, with the budget, it is a 300-day process. It's already started for the next year. So too is the development of substantive policy, right? No one is showing up in January and just starting to work on something. We are all starting to set our agendas and engage with our potential sponsors of our legislation now. And so I think it's important, as Marilyn said, to be attending those town halls, but also be doing community work. Some of the greatest lessons I've learned in doing policy advocacy work have been from community organizers who were listening to people's everyday, the impact of policy in everyday people's lives, and then coming together to form policies that will impact those issues and address those issues. So that, again, going back to coalition building, but also really understanding where there is an identified need and building strategy around that. And so it's good to have, the one-on-one conversations and to float ideas, but really building within your community shared interests about how you want to bring things to the local and statewide level. Truly, when we passed the Crown Act, it was a miracle that we passed it in its first year. Thank you, Senator Pope. Because generally it took us 5 years just now to pass some legislation. It took us 7 years to add strangulation to the D.R.I.V.E. Statutes. This can be long game work. And so you want to build coalition, you want to build movement together with other people, and then request those meetings to participate and build an agenda.
All right. How about Monet?
Yeah, I think what I was going to add to that is something that and I know this isn't in the work of what a lot of nonprofits do, but in the Coalition to End Homelessness, we really want to make the voice of individuals with lived experiences heard, right? In all of the decisions that we're making and the policies that we bring forward and the budget ask that we have, and everything that we do from county to city to state to federal government. And so I've had people ask me a few times of like, do they really want to hear from me, or does my voice really matter? And it's like, your voice is the voice that matters. And so your question of, right, how can individuals and organizations bring those programming ideas, is that we really encourage the people that are part of our coalition to get out and come with us, and also go by themselves, right? Write their representatives, visit them during the session, go to the town halls, like Marilyn was just saying. So really bringing those people, I don't even want to say along for, right? That they are leading and we are doing the work that they need to get done, or helping them to do the work that they need to get done. So really just like elevating those voices is really big in our organization.
Thank you, Monet. And I'll give you the final word on this question, Stephanie.
Oh, wow. I don't know. I mean, I think that everybody who spoke really hit the high points. I don't know that I have more to add to that, Cathy. I think, you heard collaboration, what Monet just said about voices being the voices of those most directly impacted and closest to the issues, leading, not just, but really leading is so important. I would add one other thing. I think seeking out non-traditional allies who maybe aren't necessarily focused on the issue that you're working on, but would be impacted in some way, or that have, influence or are engaged in the community in other ways, I think I always like to, when I'm in the coalition space, look around and think to myself, whose voice is not being represented at this table? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That's going to be all the time we have for, this time. I want to make this more of a series. This has been so much fun to have you all here. And I want to do it again. Will you come back if we do it again?
Cathy, can I have a final comment on that?
Yeah, please do.
On my notes, I say be persistent, but be patient, because as someone mentioned, it might take 7 years to get a bill through. So I would say be persistent, but be patient.
That's a good final word for this segment. I want to thank you, all of you. I know you're so busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to our constituencies. And I'll let just like one last word from the electeds about this. Did you guys have anything to add to what we were just told?
One of the things I do, Cathy, and I think it happens among all of us, is we also look for people to come to us, but we go to them. For example, I might have coffee with constituents, and I ask them to come and I will buy the coffee. Or I ask them, it's important for you to call and write about specific items that are important to you. And each one of us has an email that is on the NM Legis website. So use it.
All right. Well, that's really great for how to get your voice heard. And now we only have a few minutes left. We try to cram so much into this 90 minutes, and we want to make sure that we just touch on, and we're just going to get to touch on, the legislative journey of a bill. And I want to thank everyone who participated in segment 2. We're going to end really on the legislative journey of a bill. I'm going to invite Adrian to come back and talk to us about the legislative journey. And I think I'm just going to let you, give us the cliff notes. Give us like 3 minutes on all 3 of those questions so that we can wrap up and I can let the electeds have the final word.
Of course. So any bill that is going to be introduced has to be drafted, right? And in order to get drafted, we have a team of lawyers within the legislature that would do that. The sponsor of the bill, or potentially someone who is just, supports the bill, would be a legislator, and they would instruct the drafters to start working on this bill. And what they do is they look at existing law, they look at, your concept, what you're trying to accomplish, and they also take direction, right, as to how that bill is going to be formatted. So the key to it is making sure that it doesn't clash with any existing legislation, that it accomplishes what you want, and it doesn't have unintended consequences. So that's a very difficult balancing act, and it takes time to draft a good bill, because it's easy to write out, law, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good law. So after the bill is drafted, the sponsor will basically sign off on it, and they introduce it at the beginning of the session. The session, usually the first half of the session, is the period to introduce a bill. And once it's introduced, it then gets referred to usually 2, potentially 3 different committees within that chamber. And it would then get scheduled accordingly within those committees, get a public hearing. During those hearings, there's always public comment. Those agendas are usually posted 24 hours in advance, hit or miss, because, you know, it's a very short time frame within the session. So it might be posted that morning for when that bill is going to be heard. During the session, there are public comments that are accepted through Zoom. So the committees will provide the Zoom option. You normally have to notify the Zoom operator in advance that you want to speak, so they can let the chair know, so that way they can acknowledge you to be able to speak. Once the bill goes through each committee and gets a passing vote, then it gets to the floor of that chamber. The chamber then has to pass that bill, has to get over to the other chamber, gets assigned to committees, goes through the same process, passes that floor, and then it gets sent up to the governor for final signature, a veto, or a pocket veto, which is basically saying it's like the governor's not giving a reason why they're not going to sign it, they're just not signing it. And upon signature, that law basically takes effect. I want to say, I don't remember the exact, maybe 90 days, more or less. There's a certain number of days, I don't exactly remember off the top of my head how many days, when the law usually takes effect, unless it has an emergency clause. And an emergency clause basically means that this is an emergency. We need this to, upon the pen hitting paper, become law in the land. And in order for that to happen, you need a 2/3 vote within both chambers. So usually that requires a bill to really be an emergency, or requires at least bipartisan vote. So that's the quick and dirty of the voting process and how bills work. Note that throughout this entire process, any bill can be amended, and amendments are added by majority vote, and it can be in committee and it can be on the floor. And at any point in time, the bill can be completely substituted, as long as the substitute relates to the core of what's referred to as the byline, which is like, what is this piece of law trying to do? And that's usually that first little paragraph. Once you open a bill on the NMLegis website, that first paragraph gives you the byline. First section, it's like for broadband, for education. So it's the category. And yeah, I'll pass it over to the legislators.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give you guys the last word. We're unfortunately out of time. It went by really fast. I hope you guys will come back again so that we can drill down into some of these. We'll call that, Adrian, the cliff notes on the journey of a bill. But we'll drill down more into it the next time. So let me go to you guys just to close.
Well, I will start to close. And so what I want to remind everybody is, when you have an idea, remember, we don't have a lot of staff. So your research is really important to us as we continue to put an idea forward. We also work really hard to make sure that there are events within our districts that bring our communities together. That's hugely important. But the most important item is that we enjoy representing you and being your voice in the state capitol.
Representative Anyanonu.
Yes, thank you. I just want to thank you for putting this together. I also want to absolutely echo everything that Representative Herndon just said about bringing communities together. That is the best part of this job. I, of course, want to give a special shout out to the panelists for spending time with us and really going into details. And yes, please continue this series. We could do a whole episode just about process of like how a bill becomes a law, the extended Schoolhouse Rock, and I am so here for it. I will nerd out so hard. So please do invite me back.
I will.
I just want to thank the Black Leadership Council, the panelists, and I just want to mention something. You know, Alexandria Taylor talked about us getting the Crown Act passed here in New Mexico, but that was community led. It was led by the community even before I was elected. And so I want folks to remember that. That's where some of the best legislation comes from. Now, it might be authored or copied from another state, but that's where it usually comes from. And that's where the support happens, where they reach out to other reps, other senators. They're showing up in committees. They are presenting, they are testifying on behalf. And so always reach out to your legislators, and don't just do it one time. Like you mentioned, we're unpaid. Folks are busy. Sometimes folks don't answer a voicemail. Folks don't answer every email. And so you have to be persistent and don't take it personal, because even a person like me that's retired and has time, sometimes I miss phone calls and don't call back. So just keep that in mind.
I want to thank you all for always answering my calls. I want to thank all of our panelists tonight. This has really been fun for me, and I want to make it like much more of a series. You guys let us know if this was beneficial to you at all. If there's something else that you'd like us to talk about, we're happy to do it. Everybody said they would come back. I want to thank all of our panelists. I'd love to thank Jordana Thompson, who is our production manager for this tonight, and also Emil Creighton. Everybody that you see there on the screen, we just really thank you. And if I didn't mention your name, charge it to my head and not my heart. I love all of you guys. I'm Cathryn McGill, New Mexico Black Leadership Council. We'll see you next time.